Recording. Okay, welcome everybody. Well, thanks for joining us tonight. This is one of my favorite subjects. We're going to be talking about hiring, onboarding, and field training. I've got a couple announcements. The first one is next month, we're going to be doing another EMS leadership podcast called Leading from the Middle. Aaron Reinhardt is going to be joining us from Safe Tech Solutions. That will be really geared towards field training officers, supervisors, and managers. So we're really targeting the middle, but really everybody could benefit from that. So feel free to join us for that in March. And then I wanted to remind you about our virtual simulated sessions that we're partnering with the Michigan State University Learning Assessment Center on. Those are an incredible experience. If you haven't gotten a chance to get into one of those sessions, I highly recommend it. I had the pleasure of attending myself, and it is a very different learning environment, and they do a really great job. Every couple months, we are bringing out new topics for that learning experience. So the topics will not stay the same, and if you love it, you'll be able to attend more than once. So tonight I have a special guest. I have Ben Wassman from Safe Tech Solutions joining us. I'm going to give an intro to Ben, and then Ben, let me know if I've done this justice or not, and you can feel free to add to this. But Ben is coming to us from Safe Tech Solutions. Ben has more than 20 years of experience in EMS and knows and understands EMS operations in both paid and volunteer EMS organizations. He began his career in a small rural BLS ambulance service, and through the years has helped to advance his service to a combination full-time volunteer ALS system. He recently celebrated 21 years with his department, where he still works as a paramedic. In addition to his volunteer and frontline experience, Ben is the Director of Operations for a private, not-for-profit ALS critical care EMS service. Prior to becoming the director, he held numerous roles, including paramedic, field lead, supervisor, and manager. In addition to his EMS experience, he has been a firefighter and has worked and trained in the fire service arena. So Ben, welcome.
Thank you, appreciate it. Glad it worked out.
Yeah, was that a satisfactory introduction?
It was perfect. The only thing is, those were written about 6 years ago. So add 6 years to all of those dates, and trying to get those things updated, it's not as easy as you would think. But yes, otherwise, perfect. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides if that's all right. So we'll get those up. And Ben, I'm just going to be basically pinging ideas off of you, and really, I mean, just putting you on the spot. So
yeah, no problem. I'm here.
Awesome. I can't wait to hear some of your answers to some of these questions. I think they're going to be really great questions. So one second. There we go. So we're going to cover hiring first, and this is an open venue, so feel free to type your questions into the chat box. We're going to be doing some pausing here and there. Feel free to raise your hand. Victoria has her eyes on things. If she doesn't catch you, just go ahead and type in the chat box and we'll be checking back. So the first part, hiring. I love Simon Sinek, and he always says things very well. So the key to a strong workplace culture is a shared sense of why. When we're clear about why we're here, where we're going, who we serve, and how we're getting there, people start to feel valued and fulfilled. How many people inside of your company today, right now, can articulate why your company exists beyond just making money? So for us, I think this is a great point. And it's not just about why a company exists for us, but why we're doing things. I think oftentimes employees kind of get lost in the how, and I think managers and supervisors often communicate a lot of the how and the what, but we forget about the why sometimes. And so I really wanted to bring that to the forefront to kind of just plant that seed in our minds as we're talking about some of the things we're doing in our own agencies, and starting to ask the question, well, why are we doing that? And what's the reason behind that? So with recruiting, I pulled 2 random publicly shared flyers from the internet, and I wanted to illustrate some points with these. So the first one is from an agency called Hall. I don't know who they are or where they are, but they were distributing flyers, and I pulled this from the recruitment flyer. And so this is example number 1. And example number 1 takes you through, okay, what's going to happen to you as you become an employee here, and what's your career progression? So when you look at example one as a flyer, as a recruitment tool, and you compare it to example two has a lot of literature about pay and where you'll be working and what your equipment will be. But the big pull and what stands out in example number two in the flyer is the pay, right? So you've got two very different philosophies here. And the reason I wanted to start with this is to start thinking about when we use recruitment tools and we put material out there for folks to come to our agency, what exactly are we selling to them? What type of lifestyle? What are they going to get from coming into the organization? Is there longevity? Is there great pay? Are you going to be promoted? We should really be mindful of what we're communicating and how we're communicating it in our flyers. The other thing I especially enjoy about the flyers these days is now hiring. We're now hiring. I think it's a given, unfortunately, in most realms of EMS. So when we say now hiring, I always kind of snicker a little bit and think, yeah, we sure are. So when it comes to job descriptions and transparency, one of the things to kind of think about is, how does the job description make you feel as a candidate when you read it? So when we write a job description, we should put ourselves in the shoes of a candidate, and we should imagine what that candidate looks like, and what they would want to read in the job posting. Of course, there's some logistics that you have to put in a job description and posting, but thinking about that candidate, what would really attract them and draw them in? Oftentimes, if I've ever been on the market, hunting for a job or looking for a position, I was always drawn to agencies that use their mission and value statement or their culture statement in their job description. And oftentimes it was a culture statement that resonated with me. It gave me an insight into that agency, and it made me feel something when I was reading the job description. It wasn't just a job description. So they always stood out when reading a job posting that had a description in it. Does your job description represent your company well? Do you include your mission and value statement, as I just said? And is the description of the role clear? So what I mean by that is, especially in leadership positions, are you describing the role in the sense of, this is exactly what you'll do within the confines of this agency, and maybe even talking about who you will be reporting to, or your reporting structure, and even getting as transparent as posting the salary or wage that goes with that position. There's a lot of human resources chat about being transparent with wages to save folks time and for them to just really understand, oh, this is where I'd be going, this is what I would be making. Some people really enjoy that transparency. I would love to just see that up front. That way you don't get into an interview and find out that the position is paying 50% less than you thought it was, and then you've just wasted their time and yours. So I really like that concept. I think it's pretty neat to just be upfront about your wages and maybe even some of the benefits that come along with the job. So some things to think about for us when we're posting jobs, especially in competitive markets, or really in a market where many agencies are hiring and we really need folks. How do you draw those folks in before you even have a conversation with them? What does that recruitment tool look like to you? So Ben, how do you feel about wage transparency, and do you feel wage gaps are a driving factor for recruitment? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, wage transparency is a really important thing. And I know it's difficult because I want to respect the fact that we may have volunteer systems that are listening in, we may have full-time systems that are listening in. And so I realize that these answers aren't always the same. So if I hit a topic and I miss something that says, well, that's great, Ben, but we're a volunteer agency, push back, feel free to press me on it because I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. But I agree with what you said, Andrea. Wage transparency is important in the sense that if you're going to put somebody through the process and then all of a sudden give them an offer letter, and that's the first time they see the wages, you're probably doing a disservice to yourself, to your time, and to their time. So I think there's definitely a time and a place for that. But I recognize, going back to the volunteer thing, if you're going to put out there, well, here's what we pay and it's nothing, or here's what we pay and it's maybe per call. I understand that unfortunately that may scare some people away. So that may not be your leading thing for recruitment, but again, that's more about the why, right? The community, the giving back, all those other pieces that we want to work on as well. So I do think it's important. And I think the wage gap is absolutely a concern. It's an issue. We certainly have it in our organization. I have a lot of staff that will come. I have a lot of candidates that will come. And when they see the offer letter, the first thing they say is, well, do you pay for experience? And I'll just speak from personal experience or our example of our organization of how we've chosen to do that. We've been very deliberate to say we don't pay for experience. And I'll also be the first to admit we've probably lost really good candidates for that. But let me explain just quickly why we don't do that. So I have an issue. Our organization has a bit of an issue with loyal members who have been part of our organization for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And then all of a sudden I hire somebody new, but because they work somewhere else for 10 years, they're going to start at a higher wage than somebody who's been with me for 4 or 5 years. That's the challenge that I have to kind of I have to balance in our organization as to whether or not we do that. So again, I may be getting a little detailed here. I apologize, but we found a way that says there's certain certifications you may get that maybe will compensate you differently for. So at least there's some reason why. So our service area covers both Minnesota and Wisconsin. So our staff have to be dual licensed as well as registry. Wisconsin recognizes critical care as a licensure and Minnesota doesn't. But all of our staff have to have Wisconsin critical care. That's an additional 160 hours of education on top of paramedic. So if you come to us with Wisconsin critical care, you may get a bump in salary. We also have a program that we work with the local air medical service. And so we really promote the FPC, the Certified Flight Paramedic. And so if people want to go and do that and they're willing to get that certification, then we can look at that as another step for them. So that's kind of the way we can adjust. If somebody comes to us and has experience, but they've got some certifications that we need and we recognize, we can maybe bridge that gap. But again, the short answer, Andrea, is it is absolutely a challenge. We've lost people as a result of it. But I think as you're probably going to get into, I think there's other things besides just financial compensation that should be really important to not only your organization, but the people that you're recruiting.
Yeah, for sure. And, not to get all deep, but who you work for is so much more important than your wage. And that's something I've learned during my career is if who you're working for provides a healthy environment and professional development, that can be so much more valuable long term than a dollar difference an hour or whatever it may be. So yeah, some very good points. I love that. Thank you. So do you know who you're looking for? So oftentimes in conversations with EMS agencies and folks just out in the field, maybe a soup that's hiring, I have these conversations with folks, and I think oftentimes we can be guilty of just not being very clear. We may think we know who we're looking for, but then when we get challenged on the characteristics that we're looking for in a candidate, oftentimes we might stumble and go, I really never sat down and thought about it. Just because I've been in that rat race of trying to just get these positions filled, it's the same thing with anything else in life. If you really haven't gotten clear on it, you may not be as clear as you think you are. And sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until you find it. And then you think, wow, I need to hire more Bens. I need to find more of those folks. So many EMS organizations are kind of stuck in this cycle of interviewing to hire. And I totally get it. And I don't mean to be insensitive in saying that. And we need to look to be clear on just who we're looking for. And that could be as simple as writing down who that candidate is before we start an interview process. And of course, the team needs to decide that and the culture needs to speak to that. And should an EMS workforce culture be all inclusive? So this question is not a diversity question. I'm not talking about any of that. What I'm talking about is all inclusive in the sense that, again, we're not clear on who we want. We really want to get the positions filled. And how far are you willing to stretch your culture to be inclusive? The other thing is, I was working on a mission statement for an ambulance service. Well, they actually called it a culture statement. And they were really loose with the word inclusive. And one of the things I brought up to them is be very careful with that, because I would push back on that and say, how inclusive do you want to be? So Ben, I would love for you to kind of just chime in here. Do you have any thoughts on inclusivity, not diversity, but inclusivity when it comes to bringing people into a culture? And can we be too inclusive to the point where we stretch our culture and then start having culture problems?
Yeah, I think it's It can certainly go a lot of directions, this answer, because this is really important what you're talking about, and the connection of the culture of the organization and bringing on people. That absolutely is a critical part of it. And I love how you started this with Simon Sinek and talking about the what and how and the why. There's many examples I can give you. I'll give you a quick short one that you can research on your own and look into. But an organization that is so strong at doing this, when you look across the board at national averages, highly engaged employees usually makes up about 33% of the workforce. There's an organization out there that their employee engagement is ranked at like 98%. And you'd never believe the company by just thinking of it, but it's the company WD-40. They're the ones that make the lubricant, right? But if you look at why they do it and how they do it, I just looked at their website before we started this because I wanted to see if it's changed, and it's changed a little bit. But the intent of why I tell that story is before you even apply to go work at WD-40, when you get to their website, it talks about their culture, it talks about who they are, and it had a list of bullet points about we believe in supporting each other, we believe we work as a team, we don't bring people down, we're here for the greater good, and just bullet point after bullet point. And at the very bottom, it said, if you believe as deeply about these values as we do, please feel free to apply. And so I want to connect that because not only is that so important from the very first moment that they feel your organization, but why that's important because culture is what shows high engagement, and high engagement is then in turn what really helps with your recruitment. It helps with your retention, your low turnover. And so going back to kind of what you're saying about inclusivity and how that can affect culture is absolutely important. And so again, I know going a little further into kind of the presentation, we want to talk about what are we looking for in a candidate, what aren't we looking for in a candidate, how do we figure that out? That's one of these pieces that goes back to kind of what you said in this slide is many organizations are just looking to hire. And again, I get that too. That's the meat in the seat. If they can fog a mirror and have a pulse, that they're hired, and we get that. We understand that people are in current issues now where the staffing just isn't there, and so you have to get people on the trucks. What we encourage you to be wary of is that when you do that, and when you're not being very clear about it, and you're starting to separate those that you don't feel are part of your culture, then are you looking at the long-term strategy? The long-term strategy is hiring the right people and building a team and a culture in the organization that others are going to want to be a part of. And while it may fill a seat right now for the next 6 months or the next year, what is that damage then causing by having those people in your organization, potentially causing drama, being toxic, spreading what we call kind of the cancer? So I kind of answered a whole bunch of different things there. Hopefully I got to kind of your point, but all of that connects. And as you can imagine, we can talk for hours just on this topic. So I'll try to keep them short.
Absolutely, I agree. Could talk about it for hours. That was excellent. Thank you. The way the interview is set up. So, I did some reading and they talked about relaxed versus tense interviews, virtual versus in person. And obviously that's becoming more of a overarching issue with COVID. But I started asking myself, in all of the interviews that I've been in, what were the interviews that I most enjoyed and I had a most impression of? And I have to say, the more relaxed and formal interviews, I remembered more. And I think it was more about the depth of the conversation and the way it made me feel when I was in that position. But also, we have to keep in mind that we are interviewing people for performing under pressure. That's a big part of the job. So, tying that into the interview process isn't necessarily a bad thing in EMS. But, how you set up your interviews and also how you structure them. So I was reading a good article in EMS1 about how having your structured interviews pre-planned with your staff is actually a cost savings and efficiency mechanism that a lot of the large corporate entities use. And I never thought about it that way. So, you interview at a certain time, you then bring them in for interviews, and then you onboard them at certain times. And those are all pre-structured. Which is interesting because in a small rural service, you may not be able to do that just because, filling a seat with a candidate is going to be important, and one seat is a big seat depending on the size of your agency. So Ben, what is the most important thing that you look for during an interview process when you're interviewing candidates, and how do you find that within a candidate? What do you look for? What are those traits?
Yeah, again, I think Again, I'll try not to get too deep on this because I think a lot of this is about, do you know what your organization is trying to achieve? Do you know where you're headed? Our goal, what we would often encourage you as part of our kind of academy, the Safe Tech Leadership Academy, is, are you really clear about what you want, clear about what you don't want? So again, I'll use my organization for lots of reasons, because we went through these turmoil, we went through these challenges, and we got really deliberate about what we wanted, which has brought us to kind of where we are today. And I think how I can at least share with you our experience on that. So one of the things that's so important to us is the person. It's the culture that they're going to bring. And so one of the things that we do, and I love what you say, Andrea, about the stressful interview versus the calm interview. One of the things that we've kind of pride ourselves, and it's not a mission statement, it's just kind of who we are, is we like to consider ourselves fun, friendly, family-like. So fun, our employees like to have fun at work. Family-like, sometimes you like your family and sometimes you don't, but we're family, right? And friendly, we're respectful to each other, we're nice to each other. That was something that we had kind of, we'd really started that kind of mantra, if you will, probably 8-10 years ago. And the irony about that is, as we were trying to hire and bring on new people, we realized that we were still stuck in this rut of having an interview panel sit at a table and you sit on the other side, and we'd rattle off, tons of structured questions at you, and nobody would give you any instinct of whether they liked your answer or didn't like your answer. It was very stoic. And one day it just kind of hit us. We're like, we say we're fun, friendly, family-like. The minute somebody walks in the door, does that feel very fun? Does that feel very friendly? And certainly it doesn't feel very family-like. So we restructured our entire interview around kind of what we wanted it to be. So again, we want our words and our actions to align. So going back to kind of what you said, Andrea, and this will hopefully answer your question, is we start our interviews now with a tour. When they come up, they're greeted by name. The front desk knows their name. All of the people know who's coming into the office at what times. We go up, we introduce ourselves. They'll usually get a one-on-one tour of our facility where they're going to be. And that takes about 15-20 minutes to go through the building, talk a little bit about our service area, talk about kind of our trucks. That allows us this real informal conversation with that candidate. And then afterwards, we bring them up to the kind of conference room, so to speak, or the training room that you would call it. And we ask them some questions, like any structured interview would be. But we tell them right from the very beginning. So we got some questions for you. We sure you have some questions for us. We've got 6 questions for you. And once we're done with that, if you've got any questions for us, we'll be happy to answer that. So they know going down to sit down, I got 6 questions. They're not worried. Is it 30? Is it 40? Is it, how long is this going to go? Again, hopefully puts them a little bit at ease. 6 questions. So where did we come up with the 6? There's no magic to it. It just simply is, before we were asking 15. And when you got done with one of those questions, and I'll ask the group, and again, just acknowledge, smile, whatever, but how many times have you asked a question in an interview and at the end of it, you were like, well, I didn't learn anything. That didn't tell me anything that I needed to know. And I probably heard the same answer from everybody else, because I asked them the same question everybody else asked, define integrity, right? Well, does that really teach you anything about the person? So we got really clear about the questions and what we wanted to ask. And they were more about kind of the person. They're not clinical based. They're not operations based. It's about the person and how they handle things. They do a clinical scenario. This is, again, what you alluded to, Andrea. There's high stress in the clinical scenario, but we sit down beforehand and say, so, hey, we're going to put you through a scenario. It's going to be tough. If you've never used the SIM-Man before, we'll walk you through it. But then afterwards, we don't treat it like National Registry, where you just get up and walk out of the room and nobody says anything to you. So we sit down and say, so how do you feel it went? Tell us what you were thinking. Because we've had people that have completely slaughtered the clinical scenario. But when we sit down and talk to them afterwards, we understand their mindset or what they were thinking. It allows us to better understand maybe how they took that scenario. And then there's one other part where they just kind of sit down and hang out with us for just a short period, as we kind of, they're in between one session and the next. And I just sit down with them at the couch. I don't have a clipboard. I don't have questions. And I just sit and talk to them for a few minutes. Long answer to a short question. I apologize. This will probably be a pattern. But the point of it is it gets to hopefully see the real person. So we've got all sorts of different facets, meeting all sorts of different people, but it's very friendly. It's exactly what we want our culture to be. And it's important to show that from the very minute they walk in the door.
Thank you for sharing that. I think our viewers really wanted the answer to that question, so I think that was very valuable. There is a question in the chat box that I just happened to come across. It says, Ben, with the model that you used for hiring and employment, is your organization at full strength, or are you hurting for employees?
Yeah, good question. I tried to respond and my keyboard quit working. So I was getting every fourth letter. So I thought I'd just
No
wait till
worries.
that comes back. So we are fully staffed right now. But I think a big part of that also is how we recruit people. So I'll be honest, if we go and put something out on Facebook, we put something out on Indeed, we post something at the schools, we don't really often get a whole influx of applications. So what we've really discovered, and again, I apologize that I'll be speaking on behalf of my organization that probably has some different things than yours might. But because we're paramedic in an EMT truck, we don't really have we don't have a whole lot of challenges finding EMTs. We work in an ALS system, we do 911s, and they get to work 24-hour shifts, kind of the three big things that often draw people to our organization. And so what we found is if we try to go hire a paramedic to work for us, we've not had as well of luck. But if we hire an EMT, they often are ones that are usually working in the volunteer realm or doing it part-time and they want to get into it as a career. We're fortunate that we can hire really good EMTs and then make them really good paramedics through a transition. They get to work with us, they get to go through school. We have some, some abilities to help them with schooling. So we've really kind of taken this focus that we've said, it's my goal to never have to hire another paramedic. My goal is to hire really good EMTs and make them paramedics. There's a few paramedics that don't like hearing that, but we make exceptions. But for the most part, we're very fortunate. But we've recognized that kind of our pipeline of employees isn't coming out of paramedic school. Our pipeline is the EMTs that are out there that want to do more and want to do this type of work and maybe aren't able to do it, on a volunteer scale. And so they're working other places to offset income. And we can hopefully offer both of that.
Great. Yeah, that sounds a little bit like mentorship and coaching. So we're going to get into that in a little bit too. Thank you. So interviewing, and I've already mentioned some of this, it's a little bit different for us, right? So, I read some Forbes articles about interviewing and kind of went all over the place when I was doing some research on this. And one of the things, a lot of the agencies are doing out there is looking for, cross-training folks on soft skills and things like that, and bringing people on that have those soft skills initially as well to kind of get them in, and then the harder skills they're not as concerned about, because if you hire the right person, you can basically teach them these skills that they need. But with us, it's a little bit different because you can hire someone that's got great soft skills, that's really good with people, that has great empathy, but if they are not able to perform under pressure, or it's really just something that they just don't enjoy, it can really lead to some problems down the road. And it can be a difficult situation because you've got this great person on board that when they get into a difficult situation, they really truly become a danger or liability to your agency. So just in thinking about that in our interviewing, and Ben had already touched on this a little bit, is, there's a clinical scenario. There are scenarios built into the interview to ensure that someone can perform under pressure, and also shows that they enjoy that type of work in some way, shape, or form. So I wanted to bring that to light. And then, Ben, you had touched on some of this already. How do you create an interview process to discover the traits you are seeking? And you really talked a lot about that already. Is there anything you want to add there when it comes to that question?
Well, something you just hit on too that I think is really important is what does your service have to offer these candidates, and what type of work do you do, right? So if you're a volunteer service that does 50 60 calls a year, we need to make sure that that's known. If you're a service that has a lot of nursing homes and you do a lot of interfacility for nursing homes, we need to make sure people are aware of that. If they simply come to you thinking it's all going to be trauma and car accidents and exciting cardiac arrests, and then they get there and it's not, it's a reason why people don't enjoy the work, as you said, Andrea. As they get there and they're like, this isn't what I thought it was. So I think that's the one point I want to bring out, is that we have to be pretty honest and transparent. And if you're a service that only does interfacility transports, got to be really clear about your why. Why do we do this? Why is this work important? Why does this work have value? Why do you want to do this work, or why should you want to do this work? And so getting clear about that message, so it's more about the part that people feel and not simply just about a paycheck or about a job. And so, if you're giving people illusions of grandeur and that's not what they're going to be getting when they walk through the door, don't be surprised when people don't stay very long, or you start to get that reputation.
Very good point, and something I often forget, having been in the industry for so long. I think that's a really good reminder, because we're so used to where we've worked in the mix of whatever we're dealing with, that we may forget to even communicate that to a new candidate that's from out of area or just hasn't been in an organization. Very good point. Yeah. So cost of hiring and onboarding, and these numbers are going to vary. The source I used between $10,000 and $20,000, and really that's kind of a mixed number because it depends on where you stop with onboarding. As you continue to develop that employee, that can go well over $20,000. There's a lot of money, as you know, that we invest into our employees, especially if we're providing training, just everything, the onboarding, the uniforms. Just all of the things that come with employment, the continuing education. So the cost of hiring wrong can really hurt an organization, and hiring right can really make an organization thrive. If you can cut your turnover rates, you can definitely become more efficient. And with that efficiency comes some really great things. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the 20-year paramedic that has just a wealth of knowledge and experience, and they're still within that organization training and mentoring others. Some of that knowledge you just cannot replicate. Whereas if you get into an organization that's turning over 100% of their staff every 3 to 4 years, the most seasoned person in a division might be 4 or 5 years. And there's nothing wrong with that, but those folks that have been doing the job for such a long period of time just have that wealth of knowledge. So that can be extremely valuable. And when it comes to that, Ben, should we be doing exit interviews with folks that leave? What are your thoughts on that? And what happens if you approach someone that leaves your organization and they say, I'm not really willing to do that exit interview. I don't feel comfortable. What is that about?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I think the intent of exit interviews are really beneficial. I think if we could truly understand maybe any challenges, frustrations that an employee has that they weren't comfortable sharing while they were an employee, I think is really valuable information. So I think the intent is great. The reality, at least in my experience, is it doesn't often happen. And I don't necessarily take that as a bad thing. Many times it could be, right? They're just upset. They don't want to talk. Nope, I want nothing to do with it. Other times it's just like our employee engagement survey. We have a good level of engagement. We measure it every year, but every year we have 20 to 30% of our staff that don't fill it out. And so you could argue, well, how do you say you have good engagement when they won't even fill out the engagement survey? And often when we talk to people, what we often hear is, well, yeah, everything was fine. I didn't have anything to say. Well, it's okay. Tell us that. Tell us that everything's okay, or that you don't have anything to add. So I think the same thing happens with exit interviews. Is there are certainly times where somebody's like, "Hey, everything's fine. I didn't really have anything to share with you." So I think they're good. I think if you can do them, I think you should try to offer them if at all possible. And if you get people that will do it, great. Take that. Take it to heart. Yes, you will get people that maybe just have an axe to grind and just want to just tear into you as much as you can and try to break you down. There may be others that give you good information. So take it, listen to it, understand that you may have to take some of it with a grain of salt. But if you don't get a lot of people, don't necessarily just assume that it's bad. So I think they're great. I know a lot of organizations just don't have the resources to do it, and I recognize that that's tough. We didn't even offer them until just a year or two ago in our organization because we had somebody to do it, and we haven't had that good of reception. Of the people that have left, very few have been interested in being a part of it, and that's unfortunate. But try it, see what you can, but don't get too upset. With some of the negative feedback you might hear. Some people get pretty upset, and that's their outlet.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points. Thank you.
I will. One quick thing too, just you talk about your cost of onboarding. So this will be a full-time example, but Dr. Dan Patterson had done a survey, did research on the cost of doing what they called a seasoned EMT or a seasoned paramedic. So to replace somebody who had been that 20-year paramedic, his numbers were in the $60,000 range up to $78,000. Many of us will look at that and say, there's no way. But he literally went through and took account every single cost. So How long did HR take to post that at their hourly wage? What did it cost to post it? What was the hourly wage of every person that sit in on the interview panel? What was the hourly wage of the person that pre-screened resumes? So again, it's not just about uniforms and training and overtime, but they took all of that into account. And the reason we often talk about that is we'll have organizations that say we can't afford to pay anymore. But one organization in particular we worked with had a 50% turnover rate. 50% turnover rate times $78,000 is a lot of money that can be used in other ways, correct? Now, the downside of that is there's nowhere in your budget that shows cost of turnover, so it's kind of trying to prove the negative. But the point is, as you were alluding to, Andrea, is that the cost is expensive, and you may not know it or feel it or see it on a line item, but if you can reduce that turnover and if you can afford that, you're going to be leaps and bounds above.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for those additional numbers. That's great.
Andrea, you have a couple of questions. Denny and then Kevin in the chat box.
Kevin, I can answer that really quickly. We do, but we also do, knowing there's no way to really ever enforce it. So again, I just want to be completely honest and transparent. Yes, we like for them to stay for 3 years after helping with paramedic school. For us, it's actually a scholarship. So they could potentially get all of their paramedic school paid for. So yes, we say that we have this commitment, but in reality, if they left, we're not going to go to small claims court with employees to try to get it back. So it is a reality that you just need to be aware of. The engagement survey is a great question. We use an outside consultant to do it. A lot of the things about our engagement survey is really about, it kind of relates a lot to the Q12. So if you Google Q12, it will kind of tell you those key questions about, a good way to measure engagement. And a few little tricks to it, which again, I won't get into, I don't want to get off topic, but it's not about, do you like working here? The questions are more like, have you ever thought about working somewhere else? Would you refer friends and family to work here? So we're always kind of creating it and adjusting it according to what were our goals for that year. Did we meet them? But really, it's about that engagement. But look up Q12 and that'll give you kind of a good start.
Awesome.
And then one last thing about engagement surveys. What we like to say is consider them like a lead 2 of a 12 lead. So while the engagement survey will give you some information, it's just one view. There's lots of other things that I think you need to take into account. So don't just simply do a survey and say, okay, we did it, we're good. Or don't just take a survey and then take those results and say either good or bad, like, oh, well, this has to be it. It's just one tool that you can use, but there's many other tools that you should use in conjunction with it.
Great point. Thank you. I like the 12 lead analogy. So getting into onboarding.
Andrea, sorry to cut you off. We had one more question.
Denny, was it from Denny? I don't think it came through to everybody. Go ahead, Victoria.
Nope. He had it. He raised his hand. So Denny, if you want to ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Ben, I was just sorry about the voice, but Ben, do you feel it's important to tell your prospective new employee that in fact they are maybe doing 30% transfers versus, PIs and airplane crashes? Or do you feel you let them find that out? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so again, it's my organization does almost not quite half, but we probably do 30% of interfacility transfers, and we're not in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So I just should call that out. I'm not in this urban area where we have a population of millions of people. We're about 40 minutes north of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it's pretty rural. And a lot of our staff come from Minneapolis, St. Paul. Many of our staff will drive an hour to work. So we are a little limited on who we're recruiting and bringing in. But I also bring that point up because the facilities that we do transfers from are long distance transfers. We occasionally will have a transfer that'll be 8 hours in length. And I know some of you in Michigan and other states that we work with are like 8 hours, that's nothing. but we have some lengthy transfers, and many of them are very sick people going from rural access, critical access hospitals down to the metro for trauma, STEMI, all those types of things. So we're very clear in the beginning that transfers are a huge part of our business. And we can't build our business in 911. The way Minnesota works is you can't go out and pitch for a contract for a new area in Minnesota. It's locked in by legislature. So we can't grow our business in 911, and we can't go around tripping old ladies and not salting the sidewalks. So the only way to build our business is interfacility transports, and there's a need. So not only do we tell our staff that we do a large amount of transfers, they're long distance and often very sick people. Our goal in the future to continue to be sustainable is to continue to find more transfers, because that's really where we see our best reimbursement. And I know with speaking with Michigan and working with you guys over the years, reimbursement is clearly a huge issue, but transfers reimburse often much higher than 911. So we're absolutely transparent about it, and transparent that we even want to grow it.
Yeah, and that's part of the why right there, is just educating the staff on some of those things, which I think often we miss out on. So great. So we're getting into onboarding, and a lot of this I feel like we've already delved into. So the next question I had for you was, how does culture and engagement connect to interviewing and onboarding? And we've touched on a bunch of that already, but is there anything to add there before we get into the nitty gritty of onboarding?
Yeah, so what I'll share with you, and this may probably already kind of jump into the next section. So what we've talked about is kind of what's important to us is really not just the clinical care and the operational care, but it's that culture is just as important. So for us, we see them as equal. So our entire FTO program is really based on a third, a third, and a third. So 1/3 of your FTO time or field training time is going to be in operations, the radio, the call numbers, mapping. A third of it is going to be the clinical care. So here's the X series, here's a Hamilton ventilator, here's how we do our medication administration. But a third of it is about our culture. It's talking about customer service. It's talking about our culture statement. It's talking about, why we do the things we do. And so we really built our FTO program around the fact that culture is just as important. And again, this is new to us. This really was something that just kind of came effect last year. And it was actually a recommendation from John Becknell, who said, I think what you guys need to really focus on is you keep talking about this, but where is it in your onboarding? And we just kind of smiled and shook our head and knew that it wasn't there. So it's getting really clear about what you want, and then it's getting really deliberate about how that shows up every day.
So are you telling me that your field training officers run a majority of your onboarding process with the new employees? Is that the case, or?
Right. So good question, good clarification. So we have an orientation. Does that make sense? So orientation is they're in the building for 5 days, and that's going through all of the kind of onboarding stuff. So I'm glad you clarified that. We do try to get our FTOs in there because 5 days is a long time for anyone to sit in a classroom and listen. I often joke that it's one of the reasons I'll probably never leave my company is because I don't want to sit through orientation again anywhere else. So it's one of those challenges that I think is really, really important. So for onboarding for us, this connects right back to culture, and it connects back to fun, friendly, family-like, is when we started organizing our schedule for our first 5 days of orientation. We realized that day one, they sat down with HR. No offense to HR, she's not listening. I don't think she's going to be watching this. But sitting there and just simply doing all of the paperwork and logging into the systems and doing all of that is not what we wanted their first day experience to be like. So that first day, we did something different. We brought them in. We certainly got to make sure they can get in the doors, right? We got to make sure there's a few other pieces there. But we took the HR stuff and we spread that out so that day one wasn't just that experience of just filling out paperwork. How do we make it fun, friendly, family-like? How do we make that more engaging? So part of that is with operations, with the clinical side, all the pieces they need to learn. We do try to bring our FTOs in. We want them to be as engaged in that onboarding process. We want the new hires to be familiar with them before they see them on the truck for the first time. It's kind of like, oh, hey, John, I know you. You were there on Tuesday, and you showed me how the 800 megahertz radios worked. So we think that's an important part of just familiarization and helping them out. And we believe, again, our FTOs are that really critical first step in getting those people ingrained in not only learning how to do the job, but learning who we are and learning the culture of the organization.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Employee orientation is where the expectations begin, which we've already touched on. But if anything goes in hiring, anything goes in orientation, and surely anything goes in employment. Hindsight is 2020. I mean, I worked a few places. I've been through a few different orientations, And I really truly believe, like, when you look back at your time at a specific agency and you think about the orientation, everything that you need is right there. And oftentimes the culture really shines in your first couple days within the organization. So, just being mindful about that. So first impression, everybody remembers their first day. Often they remember their last day as well. And then thinking about, how much in person versus virtual, because I know a lot of us are all about, now that we've delved into the virtual world, we're more comfortable with it. Agencies are starting to realize, hey, there's some cost savings here. We're seeing this with conferences now. Hey, there's some efficiency and cost savings. And how far are we going to take that? Do you want to onboard someone completely virtual, have them maybe for an interview, and then the whole process is through the computer? I don't know. That's something I think we need to think about our culture and where we're going and why we're doing what we're doing before we decide what we're going to do virtually. And then who the employees meet. There's nothing worse than being in an agency for years and never having met the CEO or the VP or the COO or whoever it may be. I often find that employees that have never met these folks just make up stories. There's a story. I walked by him in the hallway the other day and he frowned. He's not a good person, or he's this or she's that. It's really important that the employees get the chance to meet who their leadership is. And if they're not getting that chance, the stories can just be whatever the story is, because you're not telling your own story. And Ben had talked about, fun and family like. I mean, you've never met your family. That's not family like. And what if you are a small agency and you only need to onboard a single employee? How does that work? How do you approach that? And how are you efficient about it if you are on a pretty tight budget? So Ben, you have a lot of experience in that paid volunteer realm. What if you do, you've got a really tight budget and you got somebody great that wants to come on board, but it's a single person. How do you approach that in an efficient way? Do you have any recommendations or advice to give to those out there that are doing that?
The part about just the limited resources is difficult. I know with volunteer systems, often there's not pay for training, so you take that into account. But I do think one takeaway that I think is pretty important, and this again, it comes back to culture and it comes back to what are you trying to achieve. If today you have a culture that's not great, right? Maybe it's not toxic, but maybe it's not great. Usually there's a few people that are kind of spearheading that, right? And we often call them the vocal minority. And so usually there's not a lot of them, but they're certainly talking a lot, right? What I really encourage folks to think about is when you bring that new person on, who are you putting them with? And yes, they may be the most senior person. Yep, maybe they're the best person clinically, but if all they do is BMW, and if you haven't attended our class, BMW stands for bitching, moaning, and whining. If that's all they do all day long, do you really want that new employee with them? That would, I think, be the take-home advice I would share. But I just want to, you hit something on the head there that I want to reiterate is, if the CEO, COO, fire chief, whatever your title is, and however big or small you are, people don't need to be intimidated by you to respect you. And so you often will see the folks, it's like, well, that's the new firefighter and I'm the fire chief and I'm not going to say hi to them. I'm going to pass them in the hallway. You're not building respect there. The intimidation factor isn't gaining you anything. So to simply walk up and give them a firm handshake is absolutely going to gain them some respect. And again, bring back that family environment, which is important, I think, if you want people long-term. And just one other little thing that I'll share with you. We also had realized that with our onboarding, we had new staff that were coming into the building, but boy, day one, they were with the operations team and then they were doing some HR and then they were doing this, but then they'd come downstairs and the rest of us would be around, but we've never really been introduced to them yet. Maybe we passed them in the interview process. So on day one, an hour and a half into orientation, after they've kind of done that initial setup to get in, we have what we call coffee and donuts. And we bring in coffee and donuts and then sit down and we take a half hour and longer if we need to just sit around a big table and we just have coffee and talk. We get to meet all the new people. They get to meet us. Everybody in the building is there. And so again, doesn't matter how big or how small you are, but our accounting folks know, our billing folks know, our collections folks know, all the operations people know, the clinical folks, they all come in and we all sit around and just kind of hang out and talk for that first 30 minutes. And that's on day one. So it's not that awkward, oh, I'll meet them tomorrow, so I'm not going to bother introducing myself today. It just takes all of that and just makes it happen more organically from day one.
Love it. So really quickly, 2 questions popped into the chat box. I think I know the answer to the first one, but correct me if I'm wrong. So from my experience, significant culture changes are not quickly accomplished. How long do you expect a significant culture change to take? I believe it was 5 to 7 years on that
Yep.
one? Okay.
Exactly. 5 to 7. So
Yep.
buckle your seatbelts. And again, we could talk for we could talk for more than an hour about culture, but yes, it's not going to be a quick fix. And you may find yourself with ebbs and flows. But if you really want to get serious about it, prepare to spend the time to do it. But it can be done if you're serious about it.
For sure. And the decline, I mean, a perceived decline most likely will happen, but that's because some of those toxic or just individuals that don't belong are going to exit. And I think people get really discouraged there, especially when you're already at, you have a staffing crisis. So, warning people that that could happen, and that's change. That's what that is. That's not you doing the wrong thing. And then Joel, any advice on what to do if you can't avoid putting them with a BMW person? Boy, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one, because again, I would push back and say, why can't you put them with someone else? And again, I understand that there could be all sorts of reasons that we could talk about. I think the deeper rooted issue there is, why do you have that person? And again, I realize that's not a simple answer, and it's easy for me to sit behind a screen and say that. But we have some exercises that talk about your toxic employees and what to do with them. And our encouragement is, you got to get rid of them. You got to get rid of them right away, because like I said before, if you put that new person with the one that's going to just constantly be bitching, moaning, and whining, you're just going to have another one. You're just building that. And while this is, again, it's about the long-term goal. This is about the future. This is, what's our vision for what we want to become? But we have to start taking those steps now. And the steps now are biting the bullet and doing what we have to do to put them with someone else, or train them ourselves, or do something like that.
My hands don't hold on to it.
What's the phone?
So that's actually a really good segue right into mentorship. So, we were talking about BMW employees, and oftentimes I don't want to say, there are times where I don't think you can mentor someone out of it, but I tend to see the glass half full. So, considering whether that person was ever mentored, I mean, maybe the person that they got put with was a BMW person, right? And then they learned those toxic traits. Or think back to the first role that you were ever in an EMS agency. I know for me, I learned some traits that weren't really great, and it was just because of what was going on within the organization. But I think mentorship in our field is something that we are kind of struggling with when it comes to developing programs and really putting people with really good mentors. And I think it's a tough position to be in if you are an EMS agency, where not only you have a crisis, but you also have a cultural crisis. And so you don't have those people that you can go to say, you know what, Ben's a mentor, Aaron's a mentor, Sarah's a mentor. Let's get these people in field training or in an education position and start teaching the people that need it some really good habits. So with that, let's talk about onboarding, because that does connect directly to mentorship. And let's talk about some best practices. So I'm sure this will come up again, but the typical quality assurance QI type of planning, right? You plan, you do, you check it, and then you modify, act on it, and you can even do some more planning until you get it right. And I think with onboarding, field training, hiring, this reigns true for all of those practices. But when you're onboarding somebody, what are some of those best practices when it comes to onboarding? I mean, I know for me, mentorship, I think, is something I would love to see developed more. I would love to see more field training officer involvement in the onboarding process, and just in agencies in general, more of a middle layer there where you have your steps to take. But Ben, what are some best practices for onboarding that you've seen?
Yeah, it is a tough one. So again, I'll reiterate kind of what I said, because I think it still connects a little bit, is our onboarding is about the 3 things. We want to make sure culture is as important as the other 2 things. And I think that's a best practice. And we're really starting to see that with lots of these other big Fortune 500 companies that are showing great things around success. It's because they're really focused on engagement, and engagement comes back to culture, right? So what is the feel of the organization? Do I go in there and am I worried that I'm going to say something and upset somebody, or am I excited because I have friends at work, or I'm excited because, you know, it's just fun when I'm at work and I enjoy it. But if we're all working around a bunch of unhappy, crabby, toxic people, work's not fun. So that's why culture is important, and that's why it's so important on the onboarding process.
Yeah.
I know that again, we've really revamped, and you'll hear me say this all sorts of times if we spend more time together. We don't have it all figured out. We're learning every time, and almost all of these things I'm sharing with you are things that we learned the hard way, and we've adapted and we've changed. And one of the things that we've been fortunate to do is after their orientation, before they ever ride on a truck, they get to do a ride along with our supervisor. And so what we see that is how many of you are all EMS people, how many of you can relate that your first day, you know, or at least first day working in the street was like, all right, well, here you go, there's your crew. And then you get on your first call and both people stand back and say, all right, let's see what you got. You know, you have no idea of crew interaction. I mean, just kind of that feel. So this allows them to get to all of our locations. They get to spend 8 hours with the supervisor, who ultimately becomes kind of their go-to soup for stuff. So kind of like a mentor, but still their boss. So I recognize there's a bit of a challenge there, but they get to go over everything they covered in the days of orientation to say, so, hey, remind me again about this. That didn't make sense. They get to hear a call come out. They get to see it pop up on the computer for CAD. They get to go on calls and just sit back and watch. They get to watch the crews and how the dynamic works with a EMT medic crew. So it's just one of the things that we've seen that kind of hopefully makes that transition smoother from kind of the classroom to all of a sudden now you're in the field, but also hopefully then begins to build that mentorship piece.
How very thoughtful. You've got my wheels spinning now. That was really great. That's a very thoughtful approach. So I included this diagram just to kind of show the downside of, you know, the glass half empty side of what can go wrong. So if we urgently, non-selectively hire folks and we put them into a system where we have unstructured field training, and with that comes unclear expectations, we can then develop a low accountability culture, develop a negative work environment, have all of the rock stars that dropped into that system go, whoa, I'm out of here. They leave, and then your staffing crisis worsens. And with that, you're going to have increased workload, right? So 4 ambulances versus 2. Now you've got those employees doing double the work. So it can really become a Ferris wheel where you go, oh my gosh, we have a staffing crisis. Let's just get some more folks onboarded. And we keep doing it over and over again. And it just feels like we're stuck in this Ferris wheel and we can't get out of it. So we've talked about some things. Obviously, culture and engagement is the forefront. And if I had to put that right in the middle of that diagram to break all of that up, that's what I would do. But looking at beyond culture and engagement and starting to really zone in on field training. So we covered hiring. We know, what our important factors are in hiring, what our important factors are in onboarding. And now we're looking at field training and saying, okay, if I start by just slowly etching away at a structured field training program, I've got my hiring good, I've worked on my onboarding, how do I do this? And it's going to be with small bites. But with that, a lot of agencies really struggle with, well, I have to invest all of this money. I have to pay overtime to my field training officers. I have to invest in education. If I promote, it's generally a paid position. So now I have to invest money into paying someone to do this position. And where am I going to get that money? So small bites, maybe you start really small, maybe it's a very small wage increase, whatever you can do. Maybe it's just a few people that come on board, but with that, you get clear expectations, you get that mentorship from your field training officers, and you get accountability. That increases employee engagement and morale, which increases customer satisfaction, because we all know if we take care of our people, they take care of our customers, which are our patients and family and stakeholders. And then you get decreased overhead and increased company profit. And a lot of times people will say, how do you measure that? Look at your Sentinel events. How many clinical errors have you had? How many backing accidents have you had? Car accidents have you had? You can even look at sick calls. You can look at these things and see, is there a decline when I start to really structure and start to infuse this type of culture? Does it decline? And with that, you can get increased pay, better equipment, quality employees, people are attracted to your agency, and with that is going to come clinical quality. So these are all interconnected in a really great way. So Ben, how do you feel field training has changed over the years for EMS agencies, and what are some best practices that come along in field training?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to your last slide, because basically this is the hardest part. And we understand that when we teach this, because I know there's a question that popped up in the chat, which is going to kind of connect to this too. But if you're not willing to get rid of those people, you're not willing to take those short-term pains by saying, I'm not going to let that person work, or I'm going to maybe get rid of that person. But you're basically, what you're talking about here is Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. And this is about taking those short-term, again, challenges for that long-term vision. And so beginning with the end in mind says, you know what, I'm not going to hire that person. I know that I need the shift filled. I know that if I don't hire this person, I'm probably going to have another couple months of really difficult staffing issues. But you said this earlier, if I hire this person now, it's that much harder to get rid of them in the future. And the damage that they're going to cause is going to just be that much greater. So again, all you're saying here with this slide is begin with the end in mind. It's a difficult thing for people to understand, because you've got to start somewhere. And going back to your field training booklet, again, this is one of our failures. We've been trying to revamp our FTO program for a couple of years, and we had such a grandiose idea of how it was going to look. We never got it done because it was so overwhelming. And we finally just had to say, just stop trying to put it on a web-based application for your phone. Stop trying to do this. Stop trying to do all this. Let's just start with one small bite, just like you said, Andrea. So don't let the overwhelming get in front of you, and don't let that discourage you from just doing one thing. Boy, with this new hire, it's one person, but I'm going to do this thing differently. And then the next time I'm going to do this thing differently. So, that kind of goes back to your question about, what are these new best practices? And I think the difficult answer to that question is because every organization is going to be different. The volunteer organization is going to be different from the full-time. The fire service is going to be different from the private nonprofit system. And so I just have to kind of keep going back, because I think it's so important. Is the best practice is be clear about what you want, be clear about what you don't want, getting clear about what that culture is that you want to create, that culture that maybe you're looking to change. And your best practices for onboarding and field training have to connect with that. If you're not connecting the two, people are going to see right through it, and they'll come to you saying, boy, they're talking about making huge changes, and they want to be the employer of choice, and they want all of these wonderful things. And then I get there on day one and it's terrible, and I'm stuck with somebody who's just complaining all the time. Then that person's probably not going to be with you long, or worst case scenario, they're going to become one of your bitching, moaning, and whiners.
Excellent points. I really love that you started with that timeline of years, because often I think we convince ourselves we're going to revamp our program in 1 year, and that is just not feasible. It does take years. So that was a really good reminder. So how do you start? Ben covered a lot of this, but do a talent scan. Make sure you have some good people that you can rely on for a training program. Do a demand analysis. If you're worried about budget, do a budget analysis. Really break it down. How much is this going to cost me? How many FTOs do I need? Where can I start? How does this align with my budget? Involve the leadership team and the staff. The staff know they are your asset. They can give you some great ideas that maybe in leadership you would graze over or not see. So involve the staff in that and be open to those innovative ideas. Develop your standing operating procedures, develop that job description, get that all laid out, and start taking small bites, and start with just a small plan and work through it. And it doesn't matter if it's one person or it's going to be 20 FTOs, you can start somewhere and you can start chipping away at this. So with that, I'm going to leave this up for you guys to read. I found some really great research in Gallup poll, but I have one last question for Ben, and I do realize we're over on time. I'm not surprised we went over. This has been great content. But Ben, any advice for agencies about the structured field training program when I say small bites? I know you touched on it, but any last words or advice you want to give?
Yeah, again, don't get so muddled down that you can't see the forest through the trees. So if you don't have a program today, start small. I just can't reiterate that enough. Do something, make something different, and then continue to work on it. Job description you mentioned, Andrea, which is so important, and this connects, I think, to David's question about do we fire then people who aren't meeting kind of that culture? My short answer, which will be the only one tonight, is yes, we do. Now, there's obviously lots of pieces around that. So I can't just tell you guys on a quick 1 hour call to go fire everybody who's not doing that. There's a few other things that we need to make sure are in place. But the answer or the intent, again, is that the behavior is not acceptable. So with a job description, it's okay to put things in there that's about behavior, put things in there that's about their actions, put things in there that's about the culture. We alluded to a culture statement, and organizations that have a culture statement are often able to hold that up when somebody's going around complaining about everything and saying, so look, you signed this culture statement, and in this culture statement, we said, we don't bad talk people, we don't slander them behind their back, we don't do this, and the behaviors that you're doing don't match that. And so can we discipline, again, with all the right pieces in place, and please make sure you're doing it appropriately. But I would say yes, absolutely. Those people need to know the behavior is not acceptable. Can people change, as Andrea alluded to earlier? Yep, certainly. If you draw attention to the behaviors, there are occasionally people that will see it and can correct it. Often that's not the case, at least not with your worst offenders. But I would encourage you going back to that. If you don't have a job description, start there. And in the job description, make sure you have things that aren't just about clinical and operational performance. Put things in there that are about actions and behaviors.
Yes, all right. So I see a few comments in the chat box. The recording will be up on our webpage. If you have trouble finding it, just shoot me an email. But this is also live on Facebook, so go to our MCRH Facebook, and the recording's up on that as well. So we can get you the recording. Do you issue discipline? Oh, you already answered that question, so we're good there. So now we just have an open venue for questions. If there's any burning questions, you can unmic yourself or raise your hand or type it in the chat box. Here are the references as well. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. If anybody has any, I am ready, and I think Ben is too. Silence. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate you volunteering some time to come in and chat with us tonight, and it was a really great conversation. Is it okay if I share your email if anybody should reach out and want to just get in contact with you? Is that all right with you?
Yeah, please do. And I think you have the Safe Tech email if you want to use that one.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to let Ben hop off. And when Ben hops off, I'm going to put the link for your quiz eval in the chat box. So you can hang on for that if you'd like. Thanks so much, Ben. Have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you guys. Good luck with everything, and appreciate your time.
Thanks. Good night. And Victoria, you can stop streaming whenever you're ready. And I will stop recording.